First of all, I would like to thank Bernie and the team, Indexing the Human, and colleagues, especially from sociology and anthropology, for inviting us here. I will try to be as clear and as simple as I can, because the times we are going through right now in South Africa require clarity. They require clarity because without such clarity, especially on matters of principle, we are likely to reach a cul-de-sac. So when it comes to questions concerning the decolonization of the university and of knowledge for that matter, there are, it seems to me, a number of clear-cut moral and political issues, which are also, by the way, issues of fairness, issues of decency. A number of issues many of us can easily agree on. One such issue has just been dealt with successfully, I think, at the University of Cape Town. And to those who are still in denial, it might be worth reiterating that Cecil Rhodes belonged to the race of men who were convinced, firmly convinced, that to be black is a liability. And during his time in life in South Africa and in the region, because he also lived or spent some time in what today is Zimbabwe, which, by the way, was given the name Rhodesia not so long ago. So time and life in this part of our continent, he used his considerable power, political, financial, to make black people all over Southern Africa pay a bloody price for his beliefs. So his statue and those of countless others who shared the same conviction has nothing to do on a public university campus 20 years after freedom. To bring it down is far from erasing history. And when we bring it down, it's not to replace it immediately by another statue, that of Hitler. And here I'm referring to something that has happened at Wits University a few days ago, when the president of the Students' Representative Council declared on his Facebook page his love for Hitler. So, as you can see, we live in very weird times. And I'm saying that as a matter of principle, we should bring down Rhodes' statue. And as a matter of principle, we shouldn't replace it with a statue of Hitler. And I think that we can agree quite easily on that. Now, of course, some will say that bringing down statues is equivalent to erasing history. And I'm saying no. Rather, it is one of the many ways in which we can, today in South Africa, demythologize that history. The task of demythologizing history has not yet properly started. And it has to start now. It's one of the ways in which we can start demythologizing history and putting it to rest, which is precisely the work memory, properly understood, is supposed to accomplish. We thought in 1994 that we had embarked on a work of memory with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with a new dispensation that had lots of potentiality. I'm not sure that we have explored all these potentialities, but it also had lots of flaws. And that dispensation and that politics is clearly running out of steam. And we have to find ways as South Africans and people who have tied their own fate with the fate of this country, we have the responsibility to find ways in which we can repurpose the idea at the basis of the end of apartheid. Now, I think that the statue of Rhodes and the statue of men of his ilk probably belong to a museum, an institution that, with very few exceptions, has hardly been subjected to the kind of thorough critique required by these times of ours. So we cannot decolonize the university and leave, for instance, the museum and transform. Now some people will ask, but what does bringing down the statue of a late 19th century privateer has to do with decolonizing a 21st century university? And a number of people have asked that question during the last few weeks or during the last month. Are we simply, as Ferial Afaji, the influential editor of City Press, was writing last week, are we simply fighting over the past because of our inability to build a future? A future which, unfortunately, in the eyes of Ferial, is mostly about making lots of money and becoming consumers. That's how she defines the future. But the question of the future, the politics of the future, is back on the agenda. The question of decolonizing the university and decolonizing knowledge is about fundamentally putting back on the agenda the question of the future, which for a very long time, for the last 20 years, I would say, had vanished from our political deliberations. What kind of future do we want to stand for? Ferial says, no, the future, we should stand for a future where we all become businessmen and businesswomen. She just came back from Vietnam and China. I don't know what she saw there, but apparently all the Vietnamese and the Chinese are setting up their own businesses. And they are becoming consumers, and not the kind of future they are things we should be fighting for. So we have to debate that. Is it what we want? The fact of the matter is that under neoliberalism, there are not enough seats for everybody at the table. There are not enough seats for everybody in the boardrooms of the major corporations. Go to the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. I was there 2 weeks ago at some workshop with Amnesty International. I had a look around, and it's clear that the table is not large enough to accommodate all of us. So we have to debate properly on the kind of future we want for this country, but also for the continent. Because, you know what? South Africa has nowhere else to go. It cannot go to China. The Chinese are our competitors. It cannot go to Europe because Europe is busy closing its doors. 700 dead last week on the shores of the Mediterranean. Doesn't want to go to Australia in an attempt at repurposing apartheid. I'm not sure. The future of South Africa is irreversibly linked to the future of the continent. And decolonizing the University of Knowledge means breaking with a South African-centric approach to our questions. We will not decolonize knowledge and the university if we think in ethnic terms, if we think in national chauvinistic terms, if we think in ways which enhance the dark current we see almost at every level of South African society, which is isolationism. South Africa, by the way, used to be a pariah state. I'm not that's the way we want to go. And you know very well what I'm talking about, what I'm referring to. I'm referring to the extrajudicial executions of black Africans on the streets and townships of this country. We cannot be a responsible power, neither in the continent nor in the world, if we keep executing people in a country which, by the way, has abolished the death penalty. So those questions have to be put on the table when we open the Pandora box of decolonization. Now let me give you some very concrete examples of sites that need to be decolonized. And after that we will interrogate ourselves on what possibly is the meaning of the term decolonization. What does it mean? Are we using some outdated term for a reality that has gone, has shifted, has moved, is moving fast? Is the use of the term decolonization a symptom of our inability to invent new vocabularies for the times we live in and the kinds of challenges we are facing, which are not entirely those of the 60s and the 70s? So let me give you some examples of sites that need to be decolonized, not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow, but now. The first site, has to do with buildings and spaces. Decolonizing the university starts with the deprivatization and rehabilitation of the public common space. The rearrangement of spatial relations. Fanon, in his Race of the Earth, the second paragraph or the third of the first chapter, he spoke so eloquently about when describing the colonial city, the colonial town divided into segregated, policed by force, soldiers, barracks, prisons, and so forth and so on. So, it starts with a redefinition of what is public. That is what pertains to the realm of the common, and as such, does not belong to anyone in particular, because it is equally shared between equals. That's what the meaning of the public is all about. Our public buildings and spaces in our universities are not public in that sense. They have been thoroughly privatized by one language, one race. We have to turn them into common goods. And that's why they have to be decolonized. So the decolonization of buildings and public spaces is not a frivolous issue. It's not a frivolous issue, particularly in a country that for many centuries has defined itself as not of Africa, but as some outpost of European imperialism in the dark continent. It's not frivolous in a country in which 70% of the land is still in the hands of 13% of the population. It's not sustainable. It simply is not sustainable. It cannot be sustained. Not only is it wrong, but it is not sustainable. It's not the way in which we will assure the survival of all. It will end up very badly if it is not transformed. And we know this. And we can already see emerging signs here and there of people being fed up. They won't tolerate it for too long. They won't tolerate it for 350 more years. That's for sure. So we have to change it, because changing it is the condition of our mutual survival in this country. Now, the decolonization of buildings and public spaces is inseparable from the democratization of access. We have to democratize access to higher education in South Africa. In the spirit of the Freedom Charter, the doors of learning shall be open to all. That's what the Freedom Charter says. We have to make it clear. And when we say access, which is the second side of the decolonization project, we are naturally thinking, of course, about opening up those doors to all South Africans. And for this to happen, South Africa must invest in its universities. For the time being, let me tell you, this country is spending 0.6% of its GDP on higher education. It's a paltry amount of money when we compare it to what Botswana does, 2.1%. When we compare it to what Senegal, that is not as developed as South Africa does, 2.2%, with less resources. When we compare it with what countries of similar level, economic level as South Africa do, Brazil, 4.4%, Mexico, 4.3%, Turkey, 3.7%. It's not acceptable. And let me tell you, neither Max Price, nor Adam Habib, nor Jonathan Janssen, nor your new Vice Chancellor, I'm sorry, he just came in, so I don't have his name wrapped up here yet, but soon that will be the case. None of them, they cannot change this. The people who can change this are in Parliament, they are in Victoria, in the Department of Higher Education, and in the Department of Finance. So when we say decolonizing the university, and if we agree that decolonizing the university has a cost, an economic cost, that it must translate in terms of an increase of the amount of wealth, national wealth, that we allocate to public universities, then it means that we have to go to Pretoria. It means we have to put pressure on our parliament. It means we have to make sure that the Department of Finance and Higher Education put their hands in their pockets as the terms require. But when we say access, we are also talking about the creation of those conditions that will allow black staff, when they exist, and if they are not, then we have to hire them. We have to do an audit. I'll tell you how we do it. We'll have to do an audit of who is going to retirement. And we'll have to make sure that give some figures for each retirement. How do we replace it? We'll have to have talents. We'll have to have means of verification. We'll have the Ministry of Education, Higher Education. We'll have to have, I'm not talking about police, but means of verification. Like what has been done in the mining industry. You come up, you decide, okay, by 2025, these are the percentages we want to achieve. And the authorities, because most universities are financed on public purse, will have the right to come and ask you in 2024, how far have you gone? With penalties and incentives. For the time being, the government is toothless when it comes to forcing universities to transform. What we have seen over the last 20 years is that universities, just like many other institutions, strive to not be accountable. They do not want to be accountable. We have to hold them accountable, which is not the same thing as trampling on academic freedom. The two things are separate. If you are a public university, you cannot privatize the university for the benefit of one ethnic group, one racial group, or one class category. Otherwise, not a public university. It's a private institution that is masquerading as a public university. And we should not allow that. We cannot allow that. So, black staff and students, we want them to operate under conditions in which they can say of the university, this is my home. I am not an outsider here. I don't have to beg or to apologize to be here. I belong here. A project of ownership. In a country, most of the history is characterized by dispossession. How do we move from dispossession to ownership? Including mental ownership. I have lots of friends in government, in the ANC, in trade unions. I meet in Johannesburg, in my office, many of these people. And they tell me, but what's going on? Isn't that blacks are in power? And they tell me, oh, my brother, we are in power, but we feel powerless. And I ask them, what does it mean to be in power and feel powerless? What is that? What is it that we are the majority we are in power. We are the only country on earth where a black majority rules over a substantial, influential, powerful white minority. Why are we not doing something about it? This is not the case in America. In America, blacks are a minority. We know what's going on to blacks in America right now. Almost every single week, one of them is killed by the state. The last one was executed by the state. That was in Thomas Old City, Baltimore, where we have been witnessing riots for the last few days. They can't breathe. But we are not here in America. We are here in an entirely different configuration. Let's do something about it. Let's use it to advance a project of mutuality, not one of exclusion. Because the last thing we want to do, the last thing we learn from the Black Archive, which by the way is deep, is extremely rich. What we learn from the Black Archive is that our struggles are not only for us. Our struggles are struggles on behalf of humanity. So, have to do something that has nothing to do with the liberal notion of tolerance, such a right to belong, such a sense of rightful ownership has nothing to do with charity or hospitality. It has nothing to do with me having to assimilate into a culture that is not mine as a precondition of my participating in the public life of the institution. It has all to do with ownership of a space that is public, that is a common good. It has to do with an expansive sense of citizenship, itself indispensable for the project of democracy, which means nothing without a deep commitment to some idea of publicness. So I'm calling for a revitalization of that idea of publicness, of citizenship, of participation, of democracy as a foundational aspect of any project of decolonizing both knowledge and the university. Now, I didn't touch on to questions of buildings, interiors, images, the symbols, the iconography. But when you talk about it, I didn't even touch on the architecture. Yeah. But let me tell you one thing about the architecture. This magnificent hall or amphitheater, if you want. But why does it need to be closed? Yeah. Why is it that we can't see outside? Why are there no large windows? Why is it that the sun, the southern African sun, is not beaming through the space? Mm. When people come from West Africa, and first time in Johannesburg or in Cape Town, what strikes them most, the first thing that strikes them is the extraordinary luminosity of the skies. Why are we invested in a form of architecture of closure rather than an architecture of openness that is in tune with the environment we live in? Look at all our buildings in our universities. They look like prisons. And you wouldn't believe it, but they determine to a large extent the quality of our intellectual conversations. the whole question of conviviality. We have to rebuild universities as convivial spaces in symbiosis with the wealth of our environment. We have to do that, and decolonizing the university includes that architectural and spatial dimension as well. Another example, the university classroom. It has to be decolonized too. First of all, because we cannot keep teaching the way we have always taught, especially to this generation. We cannot. First of all, some of what we teach is obsolete. It is simply obsolete. It has to be decommissioned. Just like you have, you see, you have cars for Lisbon. You turn out, they make cars. And some of them are faulty, and buy them, but they don't really, well, they can't take you from here to Cape Town. And then they recall them. We have a huge amount of what we are teaching to students. We should be recalled. We have to do an audit of the syllabus, and we'll know what should be recalled. What should be decommissioned. The decolonization of knowledge somewhere presupposes the decommissioning of obsolete knowledges. And there's a lot of it that is being peddled in our institutions. And not simply in what was called earlier on Bush universities. Here at Stellenbosch, at UCT, at Wits, at UKZ, in Pretoria. It has to be decommissioned. And along with it, course, a new form of inhabitation of the classroom. In an age when that model valorizes forms of intelligence, the student-teacher relationship has to change. We need to reinvent a classroom without walls, in which we are all co-learners. It is a hard core. And Stephen, Thomas, Bernie, Kylie, they have spent years specializing in the disciplines. Hard work. You have not even, some of you have not even started doing that. And I come here and tell you, know what? You know as much as them. But that's the direction we have to take. A classroom as composed of co-learners. A university that is capable of convening various publics in new forms of assemblies that become points of convergence and platforms for the redistribution and equal share of different kinds of knowledges. Your visual knowledge, for instance, your knowledge of images is far advanced than our knowledge of some of our generation. Why shouldn't we be able to use it, call upon it in a classroom without walls? I'll give you one example. Yesterday, I was asked by the Roads Must Fall movement to hold a kind of conversation on Fanon. We were reading a specific text by Fanon. And they chose to hold the conversation, not at all in a classroom, but at in a space where people were sitting around, some of them, others were sitting on chairs, others were standing on the balcony, and they could follow from there, from above, and many others were moving in and out. They would come, wonder what's going on here, stand up, listen for 5-10 minutes, And then since they were doing something else, they would go and they would be replaced by others in a dynamic, creative fashion. And they ended up the conversation with a whole set of songs. We can change the way in which we teach and inhabit the classroom. And then, of course, there are many other areas. But I wanted to give you some examples of the ways in which university can be decolonized. I didn't touch on the fact that they have become large systems of authoritative control, standardization, gradation, accountancy, classification, credits, and penalties. It's a huge area which will need to be dealt with, especially at a time when the university has been turned into a good that is commodified, and in turn it turns students into customers and consumers. Now, let me move to the second part of the presentation, which has to do with the concept of decolonization itself, which has become so central to recent struggles in our campuses. And here, I won't go into the question of the Eurocentric canon. These are debates that are known. We cannot operate only with the Western archive. But when we say de-Westernize the archive, we have to be careful about what it is that we want. We have to be careful because, first of all, the Western archive does not belong to the West alone. It does not belong to the West alone because of many, many reasons. One of them being that, in fact, we were the co-makers of that archive. So nobody can come today and tell us, you know what you contributed into making, don't claim it. We have very serious reasons to claim it as ours, because we contributed to its making. We contributed to its making and to the making of the modern world through our own bodies, our own work, the slaves in the plantations in America, the seamen and women crossing the oceans, the beginnings of the banking system or its sophistication, institutions of finance such as speculation, such as credit, such as insurance, which is playing such an important role in today's economy. Insurance in particular was invented in the context of the slave trade, as young Mbembe shows in his magisterial historical work. So we were there when all of this was being constituted. And we cannot therefore be dispossessed of what we can rightfully claim today in the name of I don't know what. So we have to be careful when we talk of de-Westernization. But the Western canon shouldn't be the only canon. We should tap into our own archive, which, by the way, doesn't only begin with the 18th century. It's a very deep archive in which the Atlantic is but one dimension. There's a whole Indian Ocean dimension. There's a whole trans-Saharan dimension. It's an archive that is not simply written. It's also an archive that is sound, that is structured, that deploys all kinds of techniques, human techniques, in order to come into being. Now, when we talk about decolonization, look into the concept and then end it there. It's a term that shouldn't be confused with Africanization. I'll use two authors here to clarify what in our archive, in any case, what decolonisation means. I use Fanon and then Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Fanon is very keen to not confuse decolonisation and Africanization. In fact, he is very hostile to the idea of Africanization. The idea of Africanization was used in the rest of the continent, especially in the 60s and 70s. In the Congo, for instance, Mobutu's big ideology was Africanization. A number of other potentates used it as a way of masking what was precisely a predatory project, masquerading as nation building. And Fanon saw this very early on in the 60s when he wrote The Rest of the Earth. Just read chapter 3 of The Rest of the Earth. It is called Pitfalls of National Consciousness. It should be a required reading for anyone who pretends to have been in a South African university. So go to Google, Google it, read it tonight. You will think that Fanon is speaking about South Africa now. It is a premonitory text. It deals with all those issues, the middle class, which he was very suspicious of, which is being celebrated today, black middle class, new consumer class, not only by ourselves, but also, of course, by international financial institutions, McKinsey, the World Bank, the WTO. They all tell us, you know, by 2030, the middle class in Africa, in terms of numbers, will supersede the numbers in China. And when they say numbers, they see consumers. That Africa is on the verge of becoming the last frontier of capitalism. That is what is going on. We shouldn't make that mistake when it has to deal with so-called immigrants. Growth rates over the last 15 years have been higher in the rest of the continent than here. Volumes of foreign investment, they are far higher than in South Africa. New competitors are coming in addition to the old one, Western ones, Brazil, China, of course, to the point where, if we are not careful, the African question of the 21st century will be Chinese. And therefore, we have a new geography of the world and of the continent in the making. We cannot be killing Mozambicans, Nigerians here, and think that our businesses, corporations, MTN, ShopRite, Pay, FNB, Standard Bank, will be safe in Nigeria. We have much more to lose in that silly game than they have to lose. And let me tell you, investment in Nigeria help to pay social grants. That is the truth. And nobody wants of black people anyway. I told you about what's going on in America. I told you about what's going on at the borders in the Mediterranean. Wherever you go, they don't want to see you. They do not want you. So what we have to do, and we can only do it collectively, is to turn the continent into its own force and into its own center. So the project of recentering the continent, which is in fact a 19th century project, the project of an African nationality that is inclusive in the spirit of the Haitian constitution of any human being who wants to tie his or her faith with the continent. We have to revive it. You know, the choice is between national chauvinism, where we declare our love for Hitler, because that's where it leads. The end point of national chauvinism is Hitlerism. Now go and read M.S. Discourse of Colonialism, and learn about what Césaire says about Hitlerism. So the end point of let's get rid of the foreigner is Hitler. The choice is between Hitlerism and Afropolitanism. Let me put it like that. Afropolitanism in the sense of recapturing, rehabilitation, and repurposing of the dreams of the 19th century around an African nationality. An African nationality that is inclusive. That is not about secession. That is about, in the old spirit of pre-colonial times, agglomeration. Because that's how we did it. We did it through circulation, mobility. We did it through composition of multiplicities. We know how to put together things which apparently are contradictory. Just go to popular areas, the popular informal markets. Go to Lagos. Lagos is a laboratory of this. We know how to put things which apparently have nothing to do with each other through a logic of multiplicity and composition. And the third thing is agglomeration. It doesn't mean that in pre-colonial Africa we didn't go to war against each other. But we went to war, the victors who beat those who were militarily weak, and immediately after defeating them, they would, for instance, marry their wives, which means making all their enemies their parents. If you want to understand the deep logics of African history, these are some points of entry. How do you make of the stranger your parent? Even slaves could enjoy social mobility. We have kingdoms which were presided by slaves. So why is it that we let all of that go in order to espouse hideous ideologies that don't even come from our own, that are not even our own creation? So this we can only know if we enlarge the archive. This we will not find in the Western archive. They don't read one single African political theorist in the political science department at UCT. And God knows we have a huge library. We have produced a huge library. So all of that has to change. I looked before coming here on the website of the Department of History in my own university at Leeds. We hardly studied the history of Africa. And then you will tell me, what's going on? We hardly study history in South Africa. What is that country that feeds in our nation? History, geography have to be compulsory in South African education system. It is common sense. It's a matter, let's come back to a common sense. South African students, to the extent they can afford it, and here again, the state has to provide for that. Black, whites, whatever, should spend at least some time in another university in Africa during their courses. If not, they shouldn't be given a degree. You need to get out of here.
Yeah.
You have to get out of here, because if you don't get out of here, you won't know what the world is all about and what it is that South Africa can contribute to the world. So these are things we have to ask for. And it would be right to ask for them. and we would be right to share them equally. Which means matters of class, matters of money, matters of language. As I was telling students yesterday at UCT, the problem of colonialism is monolingualism. Where you see monolingualism, colonialism is lurking its ugly head just behind. We have to get out of monolingualism. We cannot go on, build a proper future with monolingualism. So I'll end it there. I have much more to share, but I have to share the time with the director of WISE. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Achille. I think this is a very political moment, but what Achille manages to do so brilliantly, I think, is to help us to see how a political moment is a deeply intellectual moment as well. I'm, in that spirit, not going to make many comments, but what I'm really looking forward to is a discussion with you. And it may well be that we should go upstairs and have that discussion in a seminar room rather than in this format. So I'm going to put 4 questions to you, knowing that you won't be able to answer all of them. But it seems to me that they're questions for all of us, and I want to try to inflect them towards the Stellenbosch debate. The debate has been opened by Open Stellenbosch, and which must be in all of our minds this morning. The first question has to do with, and I asked this question, by the way, in discussion with colleagues like Sean Fullion and others that I've been talking to about this, is the question about where we are at this very moment, at this historical moment, in relation to Black consciousness, non-racialism. It seems to me that around the country, in the struggles that we're seeing, the student-led struggles in particular, there's a really productive and helpful redrawing on Black consciousness to think about this particular moment and the failings of transformation 20 years after 1994. Achille, I want to ask you about how you read the relationship between Black consciousness and non-racialism right now, knowing that they bifurcate into a set of really, I think, really interesting questions that we probably need to keep on the table. One of those questions is, well, could there be value, and if so, what, in a certain indifference to difference? Where do we stand at the moment in the national debate in relation to an argument about difference, and how do we want to play that out? The suggestion that non-racialism doesn't necessarily need to include white people. Conversation between people who are defined by the fact that they are not white. Then also the clumsiness of the non-racial, which might be politically extremely disabling at some moments, while enabling at other moments. And lastly, just to reflect on the current moment of BC and of BICO in particular, in thinking about the issues that we're confronting in relation to race, racism, transformation, decolonisation. In both traditions, in both non-racialism and BC, there is what you would call a very demanding practice of life, a process of self-transfiguration and state, either where one becomes someone else in order to see the self more clearly than one has before as a confident Black self, or perhaps as the killing of a part of oneself in order to let something else emerge. Last night, Achille was speaking at UCT, to UCT students, saying, what you really need to do is to define whiteness, to make it banal, to demystify whiteness. Whites are not everywhere. I think that's incredibly difficult to do in the Stellenbosch context. So I want you to turn your attention to that question through the prism of Stellenbosch. I also think that where Black students in the minority, it's incredibly difficult to build a coalition in the sense of a BC coalition. Partly when it's going beyond Stellenbosch, but partly what I was reading from yesterday, there has to be some engagement with white students, and particularly white students who want to stand against white supremacy. And the question is, how does one do that in an assertive way? So those are my first set of questions. The second has to do with which archives we go to produce something else for ourselves as Africans. You know, when I first met Achille a long time ago, he was talking a great deal intellectually about slavery. And as many other South Africans at that time, I wanted to say to him, look, why are you talking so much about slavery in order to think about South Africa now, in order to think about race now? And of course, it was a really important lesson for me to learn, that one has to go to slavery to think about processes of self-transfiguration, capital, thingness, dehumanization, and that one has to go to that archive, that incredibly rich archive, consistently. It's really exciting that a number of South African scholars, Phumlagola, Khabeba Baharoon, and others, are getting us to think about slavery very, very hard in order to think about the present. But I wanted to say that it's really quite shocking to me, and it must be to you, to think about going through a humanities degree in South Africa, but not a single course on African American thought, and not encountering James Baldwin versus Richard Wright, and Ngugi versus Fanon, and many, many other resources of the African archive at the end of that degree. It seems to me it would take about 5 minutes to redo our curriculum. Those of us in this room could remake the humanities course in about 5 minutes. It's that easy to do. And so it seems to me, and I want to ask you to comment on this more fully, we should do that. There was a moment in anthropology at Wits last week, sort of transporting an anecdote into your context, where a young Black South African woman stood up and she said, you know what it's like to go to classes 3 times a week and read Hegel and Durkheim, and to feel abused by that text every time as a Black reader, sometimes by Fanon, by the way, as a female reader as well, and to consistently face that kind of abuse. It was a really important moment, because on the one hand, it reminds me of those creationists in the US who say, no, I don't want to read this stuff, it's against my beliefs. On the other hand, is it possible to summarize certain philosophical arguments without putting people, and particularly Black people, through moments of abuse consistently throughout the week, particularly when there's no one else on the curriculum except a bit of Mandela here and there. It seems to me that we can productively rethink what goes on in relation to the text at this point. The last 2 things I want to talk about are that I've been sitting in a range of incredibly productive meetings at Wits, convened by the VC, to talk about racism, where Black South Africans are not allowing anyone to get off the hook in terms of what it feels like to be Black, as a liability, as Achille was saying at this moment in a South African university. At the tea break, I asked these very same Black South Africans about xenophobia, and it's extraordinarily shocking to see the lack of transference in the arguments in relation to xenophobia. So the very same person who's just been incredibly articulate about racism in South Africa says, well, yeah, when I go to ShopRite, there are a lot of foreigners at those tills, and people in my community really need jobs. And I want to just press the shield a little bit on the kind of self-racism that implies when we think about the disconnect at the moment between racism and xenophobia. And the last question, which I don't necessarily need you to answer, but I was incredibly struck by the degree to which you put the question of publicness at the center of decolonisation. The importance of thinking about architecture and spatial relations as central to the way in which we think, to the kind of intelligences that we produce, but also presumably an argument for reanimating the humanities, which everyone tells us are in trouble. It seems to me there's very little crisis in the humanities at a place like WISA where I work, when one puts into action a form of public humanities, kind of publicness, where multiple audiences move through a seminar room in the course of a week, literally 300-400 people, which is about access. It's about rethinking the humanities project in public, with a public, with multiple publics. So it seems to me that decolonisation can help us, in fact, to save the humanities in all kinds of unexpected and productive ways. Those are my questions. If you want to just open it up, that's also fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, for some very provocative questions. Before I get Achille to respond, I want to open the floor up and take a round of questions at the very least. So please raise your hand if you'd like to ask Achille a question or have a comment or want to respond or engage anything that's been said. So please, the floor is open. I see the fighter there.
Hello, my name is Ryan Komanta. I'm a student at the University of Cape Town. I also follow Achille around the scenes this week. I want to ask a couple of questions, but I think I want to start off by saying I felt very deeply uncomfortable by the presentation by you. I think Professor Nuttall, that you.
Yes.
To some degree, the ease with which you're talking about this change that happened really affects me. Having been involved with the protest and having been involved with the conversation, and as a person who is not white, it's not an easy thing. A lot of people will say, this thing can happen, we can do this for you, we can do that for you. But when it comes down to it, and when management is criminalizing students, then the people who are saying it's not easy who are saying it's easy are not there. I want to ask a question about, we're talking about decolonization. We have a situation, let's say Stellenbosch, Cape Town, where we have the settler posturing as the native. And if we contextualize that to Stellenbosch, we have a situation where you have a university built on displaced ground, right? Very similar to UCT. So how does decolonization happen on a site of displacement, where the university itself is now going to try and claim a native position? There's a community that they've displaced, and that issue must be addressed. We're dealing also with a situation that was once described as criminal, right? So Stellenbosch University is one of those sites which I guess one could consider as a laboratory for apartheid. That was once criminal. We all have acknowledged that certain changes haven't happened. So that means it's still a criminal situation. So what are we negotiating now about? I'm very confused about what needs to be negotiated here. Does change of the nature that you're talking about, Achille, does it really happen through succession planning and the formulation of budgets? I think that certain things really need to be ironed out very clearly. If what you're saying is criminal, if it is unjust, it must be dealt with. There's no negotiation about it. I can't be waiting for some abusive white lecturers and professors to retire before I have a conversation about African philosophy.
My name is Achille. I'm a student here at the US. Look, my question is very brief. I think it's Marx who says that the dominant ideas and the dominant culture in a society are that of the ruling class. Now, what the court then does, you then delegate the responsibility of transformation and decolonization of education towards Parliament. But Parliament is the platform maybe we should get where the ruling class does this oppression. Isn't it the time that we escalate decolonization and transformation of education into a body of civil rights, a body of representatives made up of student bodies, of academics, where we relegate that responsibility from government. I mean the continuous change of ministers of higher education have failed us, and it has failed the black child. Secondly, you speak of Mbembe. He says the role of education and culture. It is not only to teach us to understand the world, but it is also to change it. The past 21 years, we've entrusted transformation on the settler professors. They've done absolutely nothing to transform. I think as blacks, we are at a point where we cannot, as Fanon put it, we cannot agree. And we are not rebelling because of a particular culture, but we simply rebelling because we cannot agree. So we cannot trust Parliament to as a role of transformation and decolonization.
I wanted to ask, with regards to talking about the education that we receive and how it's still instilled in pre-existing Western structures, yet also acknowledging the fact that Western archives refer to also to some extent represents African history, as in it still exists in that. It manifests itself, although it's not necessarily been recognized. So I want to ask, how can we bring those two together in terms of looking at the Western archives and acknowledging the history of blacks in Africa and that, but then also looking at our education and saying that, yes, it does have Western tendencies. So do we eradicate that and then look at for more an Afrocentric, or do we work with what we have in ensuring that what is on paper is also being taught to learners in South Africa and in Africa?
Thank you. Any more questions? In the absence of a further question, I have one question for you too. Zini Magubani yesterday at the Open Stellenbosch event suggested that at the moment in which universities are becoming global, African thought and African political thought must itself become global. And that for me raised a question about the nation, the position of the university in the nation. Now you were discussing some of these questions in the continent as such, and I'd like you to elaborate the question of the nation in relation to the question of the continent and the global, in a time when the university does seem to be really appealing to the global. Thank you. And there will be time for one further round of questions.
Okay. There are a lot of radicals here. Okay, let's discuss with first of all, I think Sarah, you raised some very, very serious questions. You are absolutely right that, you see, it is easy to do agitation. Just read Lenin. Lenin was excellent in agitating. To do agitation. And it's an entirely different thing to invest oneself in a long-term project of radical transformation. Agitation is about ephemerality. Transformation, in its strong sense, is something entirely different, which requires not only a lot of self-discipline. You cannot be a revolutionary if you are not disciplined. A lot of self-discipline, a lot of asceticism. Just read, for instance, Sisulu's biography. Paul Sisulu was one such ascetic. Contrary to Mandela, Mandela became ascetic, as Rita tells us in her book on Mandela, especially when he went to jail. So read the biography of Sisulu, and then Mandela's Conversations with Myself. And so many others are. Malcolm X's autobiography, for instance. You cannot be a revolutionary if you love Gucci watches and champagne and French caviar. It's not possible. But to be a revolutionary, you need to invest intellectually. You need to invest in serious intellectual work. Because what serious intellectual work allows you to do is to read the complexities embedded in any situation. We cannot transform anything seriously if we don't take into account those complexities. And when we see complexities, it forces us to avoid easy classifications. We have fought too long against classifications to embrace them in the very project we think will put an end to them. And let me be blunt. The challenge for this place, less than, let's say, Nigeria, or they have their own other challenges. The challenge here, of course, is to give more steam to dispensation we inherited in 1994, and to take seriously the idea that we are not in the business of trying to replace white racism with black racism, which ends in xenophobia and all that we know. we have, and I was saying this yesterday at UCT, we have to create the conditions such that young white compatriots who want to exit the clutches of racism can do it and can tie their fate with ours. We cannot create platforms where, because we have been asked to shut up for too long, we do exactly the same to including those we consider our enemies. I don't believe it. It won't lead anywhere. And it is something that is much more demanding than dismissing somebody or his or her opinion because you call him or her a settler. There's no settler here any longer. What democracy did is that it eliminated the concept of a settler. So it's either we believe in the project of democracy or we want to topple democracy. And then we have to say, what is it that we want to replace it with? We have to be clear about what we want to replace democracy with if the project is to topple it. And what I'm saying is that from the moment in which we agree that we want to refound the society on the basis of a democratic project, it means there is no settler any longer. Don't believe Mamdani, settler, this and that. There is no settler from the moment in which we agree, we are not coerced into it. We all agree that we'll build a democratic society. They are only citizens. And the purpose of democracy is to make sure that there's communication, human exchange between equal citizens. We are wrong if we call our white compatriots settlers. And this is much more demanding than. So the point is, we have to hold them to account as citizens. That's what we have to do. The politics of abuse, it leads us nowhere. You see, when you are oppressed, what is demanded of you is a lot. What is demanded of you is to be more moral than your oppressor. If you lose the battle over moral principles, what is it that remains in your heart? It's pure force. You want to work on the basis of pure force? They are better armed than we are. They have always been. That's why we didn't defeat them militarily. That's the reason why. We couldn't defeat them militarily. We defeated them morally. And today we are wasting the moral capital we accumulated during all those years. That is the fact. Dilapidated it. And God knows, in the geopolitics of the world, it matters a lot to have a lot of moral capital. Because we don't have nuclear arms, for instance. We don't have planes. How do you want to go and fight against them? We have to be realistic. So I object in standing up and dismissing Sarah after she has put on the table precisely most of the point we have to be discussing now. What is the relationship between black consciousness and non-racialism? What are the limits of the project of non-racialism in a country that is still racked by terrible inequalities? What do we do with the poor when the poor stands up and tries to speak in his own or her own name? In a country that is so anti-poor, in a country in which the demand for law and order is increasing, and we know what it leads to in most instances. It leads a lot of people to start voting against their own interests. It legitimates the crushing of poor people's demand by a state that has been accapared by a class of predators. So when we say, you know what, we don't want democracy, it's limited, we have to say what we want to replace it with. And most of the times, you know, what comes after is not very pretty to look at. So we have, what I'm saying is that we have to hold on to that, onto the project of democracy. What democracy means is that revolution is suspended. Democracy is about the suspension of revolution. Yeah. You can no longer settle anything through the force of arms. You have to deliberate, to discuss, persuade, take with you as many people as possible. That's the new business. That is the new business. And we are at a point in South Africa where we have to reconsider all of this. And a student movement that wants to work in the long term will not escape those dilemmas. So I am not personally for a project in which we are sitting here and then we ask white people to shut up. We have to engage with them because we are convinced about the rightfulness of the principle. The principle is that a university such as this, it has to change. We cannot compromise on that. It has to change. It is unsustainable. It is causing too much damage, not only to itself, but to the entire educational system in South Africa. We have to agree on how it has to change. Those are the principles. But we have to talk to, including those who are opposed to that project. In any case, that's what I draw from the Black Archive. Yesterday I was mentioning Martin Luther King and some others. I usually do not mention him. But I have to mention him. And somebody was telling me, I mean, he had a term, Kumbaya. When you say, okay, your struggle is struggle on behalf of the entire humanity, oh yeah, that's Kumbaya. Why don't you go and do what he tried to do? Why do you think that the FBI kept about him piles and piles of information if he wasn't dangerous? Why was he shot? Why did they shoot him? Or for that matter, Malcolm? So it's easy. We cannot get involved into too easy things, because things are extremely complex. I'm sorry to respond on that tone, but I think that these issues have to be confronted very clearly. The question of global, which Bernie raised, it's really important. You know what's going on with universities today? You know what's coming. What is coming is that university as we knew it is dead. It is dead for a number of reasons. It is dead because since the beginning of the 20th century, there have been a global restructuration of the university, which has now reached its culminating point under neoliberalism. The restructuring of the university has aimed 2 or 3 things. One, the idea is that universities are expensive. They are expensive, they are nation-state centered, at a time when what capital needs is a global market. And therefore, what capital needs is a transnationalized university. And what is going on is that we are entering a new era of global apartheid when it comes to higher education. Public universities are being defunded in America, in England, in most parts of the world, including now in Scandinavian countries, the countries of the welfare state, is being defunded. It is being defunded. A new paradigm is being put in place, that which makes a distinction between world-class universities, elite universities in charge of producing the new so-called creative classes, people with skills in all kinds of technical stuff, who can move around, who belong to a global elite, whose bonds with the nation are supposed to be weakened in favor of bonds for a kind of transnational sphere where you hop in and out. So you have those world-class universities, and any other university that does not sustain the competition is warehoused category of global bush colleges, where people are taught obsolete kinds of knowledges, where the humanities are under siege, where they get out of those universities semi-qualified, either for low-skilled jobs, or purely and simply saddled with debts and unemployed. That is what is going on. That is what is going on. So the question is, are we going to compete on whose terms? Is there a way of doing it differently? And for South Africa, it raises the bar. The project of a university that is nation-centered is under stress. So what is it that decolonisation means in that context becomes in itself a very powerful intellectual and political question. And in a country racked by inequalities, racial inequalities, and other class divisions, what do we do with some of the ideas without which we are but a geographical accident? Black consciousness, non-racialism. How do we retool them so that they can be guiding lines for a reshaping of our society, so that it includes everyone? It seems to me that that is what the project is. It's not to go back to one settle, one bullet, unless we topple democracy.
Okay, there's time for just a few short questions. So please raise your hand and let me know if you want to ask something. I see 1, 2, 3. Okay, go ahead. 4. Please give them short and introduce yourself, please.
I have a question on I think it's like the contextualization of democracy within universities at the moment, and whether, like you were saying, after centralizing the curriculum could lead to a better democratic ideal. Because when you like the relationship between race and black consciousness, for me, in my personal capacity, if I was taught things like black consciousness within my university capacity, and things like Africanist writings were taught better at university to the humanities students, you could create a population who could see race differently. If the Afrikaner child was taught about these things and could understand cultures other than their own, maybe there could be growth in a non-racial ideal between academics. So I'm just asking whether that's a viable idea.
Thomas? Recess?
Yeah, I'm Rita Barnard. I'm an immigrant at the University of Pennsylvania. And I want to respond, really not on my own behalf, but vocalizing my colleague Tsitsi Jaji, who is a Zimbabwean, also living in North America at the moment. And I want to respond to Achille's invitation that we begin to invent new vocabularies for the times in which we live. And I would also say new vocabularies for imagining place. Tsitsi has just written an essay that I think is so beautiful. She ends the essay with this sentence, which I find so moving. And it says, "We are all Makwerekwere." And this essay goes to the question, you know, the problem nowadays of words like belonging, citizenship even, a settler would be a similar word. And what she actually proposes is that the word that we can perhaps enrich and revalue is the word resident. Is there perhaps a way in which we could recognize that we are all displaced in some way, right? Or we should be. I mean, it could be a moral position that we, in a spirit of understanding xenophobia and these questions of race in the university simultaneously, could work towards. But maybe instead think of residency as a way in which we can be together somehow in the place where we are. That doesn't mean that we're not going to transform the place, even spatially and architecturally, as Achille was suggesting. But I just want to propose Tsitsi's work as a site where we can begin to look for new vocabularies that are Pan-African, a word that she revises, and also global, in the spirit of saying, you know, using that very local word, Makwerekwere, and claiming it as a kind of recognition of displacement, but residency. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I was particularly interested in criticism of agitation and your notion that democracy is the suspension of revolution. So my question has to do with time and voice. So on the question of time, you spoke at the beginning about needing to reclaim the future, and I'm wondering if what we see happening in Baltimore right now, you know, in amplifying the cry, "We can breathe," is there not a space for agitation to open up the possibility of breathing? We've heard the cry for of "we can't breathe" here in the student space and in higher education, but okay, so to follow the distinctions between police brutality in Baltimore and across the US and the transformation in higher education, you know, we want to amplify that the passage of that phrase and to breathe into that phrase, as it were. It seems to me that there's a question about how we conceive of the timing of democracy. So if in Baltimore the problem is that these are not citizens who are on equal footing, that there is a radical brutalization of some people for the benefit of others, how then do we think about opening up a space of mutual conversation when the agitation for making that space to breathe is being dismissed? And I say that, and I ask that out of complete sympathy for your call.
I'm privileging people who haven't spoken yet. Elise.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. My name is Yandisa. Yes. Mine is not much of posing questions, because from my understanding, this is clear, and this is just about how to move on from here to where we want to be. And secondly, from the citations that you've made of Frantz Fanon, also Frantz Fanon is urging us to find the real man. So I think it is time for us to find the real us, who we are, where we are, and how to go about doing things that we are supposed to be doing. Adding to that, the stolen information and the destruction of the institutions that were here before. We can make mention of Central African Republic, where the French in 1909 declared that country its colony and destroyed the state institution that was referred to as the Sultan Waldan. And many people do not know about those because the colonial system emerged to an extent that it destroyed what it found. So even to us, we still need to find exactly what did we have in South Africa. How do we repossess that kind of knowledge that we had? Also, to my colleagues, we need to be broad in terms of getting knowledge in reading. We have to look at Walter Rodney, for which is the title of the book. I turned it around how Africa developed Europe. But the originality of it is how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And where also Walter Rodney has been speaking of the stolen legacy of the African states and the renaming of the states to the advantage of the colonizers. But because of time constraints, I will limit my my comment on, even though I do not like asking questions for things that are clear, but I have to ask this one. How do we repatriate the knowledge that has been taken away from us? The last one is specifically to the students. That during the apartheid era, we had the students in terms of allocating financial assistance to educate a black and a white child. Now, I'm not sure, but I think there is still that students that exist. Now, Prof, from your understanding and your knowledge, how much does the state contribute to educate a black child? And how much also does it contribute to educate a white child? But because of time constraints, I'll limit myself to that. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. Final question, please.
Okay, mine's more of a statement. My name is Achille. I am a member of staff at the University of Cape Town. I feel very uncomfortable in this room, and let me tell you why. I think whilst indexing the human is an extremely exciting project, I think it fails in a variety of areas. And the first thing is that there are white men at the top of the project. And I think in this conversation, I'm brought back to the question of who are our interlocutors in this conversation? Who is Achille addressing? In the sense that the white space has actually invaded this specific conversation yesterday. And I'm sitting here and I'm just thinking, Stellenbosch University is screwed in this open university project. And it's more of like a call for you guys to check yourselves, you know? The very project of indexing the human had completely problematic academics in its program last week, for instance. And I'm just wondering, how do we have someone like Professor Achille and Mbembe on the same platform? You know, it's a kind of stream of questions that come to my mind that I'd like to pose for people to think about.
Thank you.
Okay, well, these are all very interesting questions. And in the spirit of the conversation we started earlier on, let's address them promptly. Starting with the question of discomfort. Of course, there are all kinds of reasons why the most common here. I understand the question of discomfort. But we cannot start from that. That doesn't lead us far enough. When it means we accept that these are white spaces. These are not white spaces. This is the public space. We have to start from the assumption that this university is not a white university. it cannot be a white university. It might have been a white university under the earlier dispensation. But democracy, this is not a white university, which means that we have to fight any attempt at turning it into a white university. It is a public university. It belongs to the people of South Africa. The basis of discussion, that is what it is. And therefore, if you want to be white here, you are in the wrong place. Because the public place only recognizes citizens, equal citizens. It does not recognize whites, blacks, and all that. That's the agenda we have to push. It's based on a firm ground. It's based on a firm ground because we do not interiorize what precisely they want us to interiorize. That when we come here, we are not at home. We should feel absolutely comfortable in being here. And if we do not feel comfortable, we should make sure that we do. By imagining, because we are intelligent people, creative people, we have to devise all kinds of technologies, mechanisms to occupy the space. And then put them in a position where they dare evict us. That's the intelligent way to go about it. Let us put them to a position where either they dare to evict us, or they have to accept that we are now living in a democratic dispensation. And this requires a lot of creativity. It goes beyond shouting slogans. Let's read. We have a library of how it is. You know that the history of Rosa Parks, for instance, in Montgomery, the buses. What is our equivalent of Rosa Parks today in spaces such as this? That's what we need. There was no Rosa Parks before Rosa Parks. That is what we need. We need to open up our mind in this age and times when the resources are so many, some of them electronic, not that. Let's use them to stop feeling internalizing what precisely they want us to internalize. They want us to come here every morning thinking that we are displaced. We shouldn't be here. We should be somewhere else. And if we are here, we are under the rule of tolerance. And I'm saying, no. Let's turn the logic upside down. This is ours. So we cannot enter it from a position of weakness. But that's an intellectual exercise as well as a strategic exercise. And the challenge for students who want to open Stellenbosch is to respond to these kinds of questions. Who are the interlocutors? It's other students. It's not simply black students. You have to talk to white students. You will have to talk to them. They are not going anywhere. They have the means to, not all of them. Those who are fortunate, they can go to Europe and Australia and all that. But most white people in South Africa are here to stay. They are not going anywhere. So we'll have to engage with them. Thank God some of them are already old. They are totally unrepentant. They are going to die in any case through a natural process. Look at the demography. Look at the rate of birth in the white community in South Africa. It's like this. It is like this. In 30 years, according to Statistics South Africa, the number of whites will be will be going through a disappearing phase. Unless we have a new immigration of whites, in 50, 60, 70 years, well, they will be like this. So just on purely demographic terms, we have to be confident. I want to shake black students and ask them to be confident. You do not undertake a struggle if you don't believe in yourself. And there are pedagogies that allow us to believe in ourselves. There's a history we can read, an archive we can draw from to feel confident. We should stop walking with our eyes down. There's no reason to do that. And then we have to be smarter, because when you fight from a position of weakness, you have to outsmart your opponent. That's what we learn, I mean, from maybe not you, but where I grew up every evening around the fire. I had a grandfather who tells all those stories of the tortoise, all these animals. How is it that there's a competition? I was always very impressed by that story. A competition between a tortoise and then a lion, and then what do you call here, a kudu. So they have to go a certain distance, and the prize is to marry the daughter of the king of the forest. And then the result was that the tortoise won against the lion and the kudu. How did he do that? The story about the deployment of different kinds of intelligences when you are weak. That's the archive we have to draw upon. So now, the question of return is, to some extent, you look at origin myths of African people. There's not one of them that is not about migration. Not one single, maybe with the exception of the original inhabitants in this area. Everybody else, when they explain their origins, they explain it in terms of moving from one place and going to somewhere else. It's about the dialectics of the elsewhere. And through that dialectics of the elsewhere, you create family kinship bonds, you create religions, you create a culture. That's how it used to be. And then colonialism came and said, you know what, I want people to work in the mines. They can't be, quote unquote, wandering all over the place. It establishes boundaries, which now we are sanctifying. And it says you don't move. And in this age, we are told that we cannot move within the continent, nor can we move outside. A double penalization. It is not possible. It's not sustainable. So, it is true that the question of movement, the right to circulation, will become central to the next generation of human rights. But of course, we're not all displaced in the same ways. Of course, we cannot let go of the question of justice and reparation. And we cannot let go of the question of epistemic justice, as Latin Americans call it. That there is some element of justice that is embedded in the project of knowledge production, which means the recovery of all the archives that might be to that. I understand, Thomas, the point you were trying to make. I was just trying to say that we cannot transform things only with agitation. We cannot. Or with if we remain in a logic of indictment. We have to be able to move from indicting to something else, which is much more demanding. It's easy to indict. But a process of transformation is not sustainable simply with permanent induction. It is not. People dismiss you, they move on. They don't listen any longer. We have to be able to put them in a position where they cannot not listen. Because the easiest, they shut up, they don't listen to you, they are totally indifferent, or they are in a state of denial. You have to make it impossible for them to retreat in those worn-out practices. They have practiced it for a long time. They are experts in denial, and they are experts in indifference. But you want them to never be in a position where they cannot hear. How do you do that? Not by calling them settlers, or in any case, all of them, because there are many among them who agree with you. They agree with you. So what is this war where you turn around, shoot at those who want to fight with you, and leave those at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange completely unharmed? What is that war? We will have to work with our white compatriots. They are not going anywhere, and working with them means being completely uncompromising on principles, taking them seriously, and establishing reciprocal relationships with them. We take them seriously, they have to take us seriously. Because we are confident. And we will end there, make a clear distinction between a logic of distraction and a logic of ownership and repossession. The idea is not to destroy biodiversity. No. The idea is to repossess it as a public good. So it seems to me all these things have to be made clear. As far as your question is concerned, I have to go and check. I don't have the figures. But the fact is that if we have failed in one area since 1994, it's in the area of education. Apartheid was all that it was. The most vicious part of apartheid was Bantu education. That was the most vicious aspect of apartheid. And therefore, education should have been the linchpin pin of liberation after 94. It has not been, that has not been the case. What we are witnessing today is that the privileges of the past, most of which have been amassed by whites at different levels, of course, they have been repurposed in the new environment. But not only have they been taken into the new environment, they are being fenced off. What is going on is an enclaving of privileges, an offshoring of privileges, including in a city like Cape Town, which understands itself as an offshore city. They fence it off, and if you attack it, they are willing to defend it by force. The militarization of property is one crucial dimension of neoliberalism and one crucial dimension of great racism. That's what is going on. Look at, I was coming here, I've been thinking about that matter for some time, and I arrived at the door over there. It's an announcement, bursaries for something, something Axiom. What are these bursaries that are exclusive to some people? Among the audits we have to do is an audit on what kind of fellowships are available to. There are many fellowships, private fellowships in this university, at UCT, and at Rhodes especially, which are fenced off for specific racial people. That's how they do it. It might not be that the state spends more on them than on the black child. It is that they have accumulated privileges unjustly, and they are fencing them off. And that's what we have to attack. So I would like to end on that fighting note. But a fight of that principle is doomed to failure, or is doomed to a reproduction of violence. And when violence is unleashed, most of the times, the weakest of ours, among ours, are the ones who pay for it. So we have to ask ourselves if that is the way we want to go, and who will pay for it.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming and for your stimulating questions. For those of you who are staying for the reading group, they'll be upstairs, probably in 401. And we'll reconvene in about 20 minutes.